discussion today. I'm your podcast host, Rameez Kaleem, founder and CEO of 3R Strategy and author of A Case of the Mondays. I'm joined today by Helen Graham, Head of People at Homemade, where she is responsible for the people function, including people strategy, performance, reward and benefits, and leadership coaching. Today, we'll be exploring the unique challenges and creative solutions that come with building HR functions in startups and how smaller organizations can wield the talent war without breaking the bank. Helen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here.
Before we dive into the challenges of startups, could you tell a bit about how you got into your current role at Homemade? And I think you've been there for around 3.5 years. So how has the organization changed and evolved? Is it that sort of startup culture? You've seen the organization grow during that time?
Yeah, of course. So I suppose for the brief history of sort of, I suppose 15 years now. Yeah, 15 years within sort of a variety of different HR roles, from strategy consulting into scale-ups, into investment management, and then sort of taking the jump into the world of startups. Actually comes full circle. The CEO of Homemade was my first hire into Bain & Company sort of 13, 14 years ago. Maybe 12, 13 years ago. It's proving the pudding of networks, I suppose, for your long-term career. So joined 3.5 years ago, and the company, on arrival had no HR team. There was a recruiter who had just left, I think. And so it was very much building up everything from scratch. I think the head of product used to look after HR, and so it was kind of ensuring that we had all the right sort of policies and processes kind of set up. So quite a hefty first year, I think, when I first joined, but it's been a sort of a fun and exciting one.
And so I guess, working in that environment, we know that one of the challenges that we face in not just startups, but I guess SMEs, is the competition for talent, because you're often competing for the same talent that much larger organizations are going for. If I think about us as an example, we're a small reward consultancy, but we're doing the same sort of work that at times might be done by the likes of PwC or Mercer. And so you're competing against global organizations. So is that something that you come across? And how do you then compete for talent and attract those candidates when you have fewer resources compared to your competitors?
Yeah, really good question, and one that I sort of I've definitely come up across sort of for the last 3.5 years. I've come from big brand names, which was obviously a lot easier to recruit into. I think back to my days at Bain & Company, we'd have thousands of applications for, 5 roles or so, and quite an easy pool to kind of pick from. And I think, there's a lot of things you can do. You have to think outside the box when it comes to the startup sort of hiring and your attraction piece. A couple of things I always look at is, what's your brand? What's your external brand looking like? And equally, you don't need a lot of money for that, right? A really solid careers page. I don't know the view of shouting out ATSs on podcasts, but I use Team Taylor. They're fantastic. You can build your own careers page. So if you know that your tech team doesn't have a lot of time to be able to kind of do that on their own side, you can always build it through Team Taylor. It takes 2 minutes. It's widgets going across the screen that's simple, super simple, and making it personable. I think a lot of the time people focus on, I don't know, sort of the high level aspects of what a business is about, but actually people would just want to hear sort of the day-to-day life stories. What is it actually like to work there? Adding videos onto those things is a quick way to show that. And actually you will compete with, some of these bigger businesses quite easily with that, because and the broader overarching piece that I always go with is, a startup is different, right? When I talk about attraction, a lot of it is about that conversation with candidates you do speak with around sort of what is it that you're interested in. And there's an offering in startups and scale-ups you'll never get in a big company. I'm sure I will be quoted back on that in a bad way, or hopefully not. But my opportunity for me started off very much as a sort of solid sort of head of people and sort of took on our operation side of the business, I would never have had that opportunity sitting in a large strategy consulting firm, for example, and understandably so, right? But it's all about those development opportunities and a broad role, and one that kind of you can define your career path to a certain extent. And that's so much of the insight I give to candidates of, if you're looking for that role that provides you with a development opportunity like no other, startup's a place for you. Ultimately, if they don't want that and they want sort of very structured setup, then maybe they shouldn't be moving to startups anyway. But I'd say that part is the second piece. So one being the brand, so what's externally facing. That also includes your LinkedIn profile and how you're coming across as a business on there. Again, be personable. Again, a lot of these places are just putting up sort of your very corporate style videos. You'll find most of your traction comes from, two employees going out for sort of mental health chats, or it might be that you're putting on some sort of charity fundraiser, and it's about those personal interactions rather than sort of big corporate piece. That second piece in terms of how you actually articulate about the value proposition of being in a business like a startup. And then the last part, which actually weirdly goes back to my time at Bain, is when you give somebody the offer, often what I tend to find for candidates is, whilst they do want the higher pay and they want the big benefits in that piece, they also want somewhere that cares about them. And you're still going to get the people who fundamentally are like, I want people that care about me, but I also want to get paid a decent amount of money. But if you're selling them based on the fact that, startup opportunity and development is there, plus, these people are actually going to support you. And part of that is, as soon as a job offer goes out, the whole interview team should be emailing that person and reaching out to them and showing them that they care. And I've very much won over counter offers before, because the previous company they've been with have just kind of said, I'd like to give you a little extra money, but actually fundamentally you're just going back to the same thing that you were doing before. You're just getting more money, but maybe the happiness still isn't there. But actually this new company, who perhaps can't pay you another 10 grand, but maybe they're paying you 1 or 2 grand more, actually seem to want you to come and join. And there's a full investment, not just from one person being the manager, but maybe there's also the senior leader and the recruiter and a peer that you met. So my advice to recruitment teams is then thinking about HR, even if it's line managers, if you don't have a recruitment team, really thinking about what's that impact you can make for that person in that process to show them that you are different and actually you have that engagement for them. Yes, you can't give the benefits, but actually the benefit is having someone who really cares about your career.
So I guess it could be a bit like you see those charts or diagrams at times where it's like a pie chart, and it's all of the things that a candidate might value in a job, which is pay, benefits, learning and development, work-life balance, good working environment. And I guess what you're saying is that people will value different things, but ultimately, unless we get really lucky, most people, when they're applying for a job, they have to try and find the right balance between those things. So you may prefer a better work-life balance to working 16 hours and getting a very high salary. So it sounds like in a startup environment, you're saying that the balance of those different categories is quite different. So in your experience, what do you find are those things that candidates value the most, apart from the financial incentives?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is actually passion for doing something that they can kind of see impact with. Often you talk about impact, and lots of businesses talk about impact and results. But ultimately, if you're, and I've sat in businesses for years, yeah, I feel some impact daily, but not to the level that you do in a startup or a scale up. You can see the results. It's pretty immediate when you make a change, or even just a full week of work, you can just see what you've actually done coming to fruition. And I think that's quite a big aspect for a lot of people. What do you want to go and do? Well, I want to go and, maybe change something, or I want to be a part of something. And this is not to hate on big brands, but let's insert name here, any big bank, right? No one's going to say, I want to go and work for big bank because I want to go and make a difference in banking. Or maybe they do, depending on the role, but they're going into banking because, maybe it's the financial aspect to it. Maybe they did accounting and finance when they're at university, whatever it may be, really strong, great careers, but they're not necessarily, their drive is probably not because they want to go and change the world of banking, unless they're going to go and start in a startup that's banking and they do want to go and do that piece. Hopefully I've not just shunned all banking careers there. I think it's a very good career. But on the flip side for, startups, so Homemade, prime example, right? You fundamentally want to go and fix the rental process. Really, short, sweet, simple. But actually, it's quite an easy thing to get behind. The majority of people rent. Individuals want to be a part of the change, and that's a really attractive piece for most candidates. So it's finding out what is your USP for candidates, and why should they want to go and do that, and how do you take them on that journey. Goes back to your first round interview, right? How are you selling the sort of value proposition for the candidate? And what is it about you that makes it different for them? Why should they come and join? Everyone always talks about that two-way piece of an interview. It's not just about the candidate selling themselves. The company's also got to sell themselves, and don't wait to do that too late down the line, because some places do it at that last stage when they've given them an offer and say, and this is why it's fantastic. But if another company is interviewing them at the same time and doing it throughout, they've already started to make their mind up through that process. And it gets to that final stage, and I'm like, well, I already know all of this great stuff about this other business, but I've only just heard it about yours now. And actually, this one sounds more exciting. They've told me from the beginning, and I've actually then been able to delve deeper through my interviews to understand what my connection is to that, rather than just thinking about it at the end.
Yeah, no, I think that's so you're saying that the communications is a really important part, because you could have a lot of those things that the candidate values, but actually they haven't really been communicated that. The other thing you mentioned was, candidates figuring out what they're looking for. And I think one thing that we think about, or candidates think about when they think about startups, is around creativity and innovation. And I was just curious whether you can think of an example where either you've implemented or you've experienced something within your team of implementing a creative solution that has helped your HR team to um, try and attract good talent.
Yeah, question. So creative solution, well, one of them was the career site, which was go and get an ATS that's got a career site, because we just didn't have enough time for anyone to build on the website. So that was one piece of it. Um, Another one that we've done, a big one actually, is assessments. We don't have the funds to go and buy a load of assessment platforms, and they're really expensive. Um, but what you're finding is that you have so many applications, you're spending so much time trying to screen through, candidates. It's really hard to actually then start differentiating between one and the next. CVs, especially with ChatGPT nowadays, CVs look very similar. How do you differentiate? So one of the things we brought in, we had an online sort of, I suppose, form type thing. So a type form, Google form, that kind of thing. And you can do it on anything. You could use Google Forms, you could use Microsoft Forms, and basically created a set of questions through those that was testing on verbal and numerical reasoning. It's not too difficult to go and do a bit of research through Google, understand different types of questioning and what do certain answers mean. And then you need to create your own scoring framework, of course, so you've really got to go and think about it. Now, I'm not saying this is the equivalent to some qualified sort of psychometric testing, but it definitely starts to bring out, especially depends on the levels of role. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting we use this for software developers, but definitely for sort of your junior entry level roles of how to differentiate between one and the next. If the role requires numerical ability, then it's quite an easy one to do a set of your classic sort of, I say long-winded questions, but the ones where car A goes on a drive to X location and then
Mm.
stops here and all of that stuff, right? Like there's some quick, easy wins with that. And actually, that's really helped us with our initial screenings, because it just means that we can filter out those who don't necessarily meet the skill level we need for those particular roles. Yeah, there was definitely an out the box thinking of, if we can't go and buy it, what are the other ways that we can actually assess to find the right skills.
And I think with those 2 points you mentioned the assessments and also the career site. I guess the other thing that really differentiates the startup environment is that you probably were able to implement something like that relatively quickly, whereas it might take 2 years to implement that in a corporate environment.
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah, I've definitely been in firms to bring in a new ATS, HRS, LMS, anything like that. Yeah, I've definitely been in a business where it took us a whole year before we implemented a new LMS, which is about standard for big companies. Bear in mind, obviously, you're going across different geographies; it's a lot bigger feed. But yeah, I mean, new ATS. I think I decided I wanted that in the first week. Got rid of the old one, brought in a new one, got it set up. It's one that I've used before. It's a strange one of, for any new sort of HR team members going into a startup. Know what you know and take that with you. Don't try and start being like, well, actually, I've always wanted that system. Obviously, if there's a financial change on that, it's a little bit different. But there's also so many of these HR, and ATS systems that are quick wins, and LMSs actually. I use EdApp as an LMS. They're great. You pay by user as they log in. You're not paying some big upfront fees. You know, I think there's a minimum fee. It's like $25 a month or something. Now, my background is in L&D. Really simple, easy thing for me. There's a whole course library on there that you can download and you can manually go and edit. You can also, it's like AI learning as well. So you can put a topic in and it'll build it for you. But a really effective solution, especially for onboarding. If you want to do some e-learnings as part of onboarding, especially for mandatory trainings nowadays, sexual harassment being one of them, mandatory training that you should all be providing. Put it through your LMS. You have a quiz at the end to ensure that they understand learning. And I realize I'm going on a tangent here, but my net point being is that there are some really simple, easy solutions that don't cost the earth. Yes, they're not as pretty as the high bobs of the work, the world or the work days. There's lots of those bigger names. Yes, they're really effective, but actually, these other systems are more than adequate for those smaller size of companies as they're going through that growth stage. And when you hit the next level, well, then you go and invest and look
Yeah.
at.
Yeah, and plus, I think there's a lot more flexibility as well. So, for example, with the assessment, you can tailor those questions rather than buying an off-the-shelf, really expensive product that is not necessarily the right thing for you. Um, Another challenge that you have in a startup environment, again, something we can relate to as being like relatively a startup as well, is you have limited resources at the start. And so you often have to make tough choices around where you can invest. So let's say that you are working for a startup where it's the first HR role and you have limited resources and you have to make a choice to say, okay, I know these are all important, but I have to choose between, do I invest in recruitment, improving recruitment? Do I invest in retention? Do I invest in the culture, or L&D? What would you focus on?
You're going to focus on one. Is it two or one or?
Well, you can have your top priority and a secondary priority.
Yeah. So I probably, depends on the size of the business a little bit. Basically, I weigh it up between retention and recruitment are the two aspects. Retention is your key, I suppose, playing card in the whole, the whole aspect of employee life cycle, right? Because retention can include a plethora of different things that can involve benefits, whether it's flexible working, whether it's, on-site gyms, whatever it may be. Equally, it falls into sort of learning and development, which ultimately helps you with your longer term retention plans and builds your workforce for the future. That's kind of implying that you've recruited the right people in the first place, I suppose, within that. But I would probably invest in more in retention, because I know that when it comes to recruitment, whilst it is expensive, ultimately, if your value position or proposition is good, there is no reason why you still wouldn't be able to recruit for those roles. If your retention piece is good, there's no reason why recruitment would be hard at that point anyway. Having said that, I do think there's a lot of noise on recruitment job boards, and it does make it more challenging to recruit at the moment. It depends on the different types of roles. Definitely, some roles get more traction than others. So yeah, I don't know. I'd probably I'd go retention is the main place that I'd focus on, and recruitment will be easier as a result of that anyway. So I've kind of circumvented that,
Yeah.
which probably is me cheating, but that's probably the way I'd go about it.
And I guess also, it's probably an unfair question because you can't really look at each of these things in isolation
Yeah.
because they tend to work together. For example, when you talk about retention, I think culture is a big part of it as a startup in particular, because that's what's going to help you really keep your people, because they didn't join you for the high salary in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, there's so much that you can invest in that isn't necessarily financial. Um, so much of it actually falls to leadership teams and to managers and how they interact with staff members. And, I think so much of it, if I was to really focus in any business, I'd think about leadership development. I think that is somewhere that people do not focus enough time and effort into. You know, First joining Homemade, actually, one of the first things I brought in was a leadership program for anybody in a people management role. Now, again, that's me utilizing previous job roles in order to deliver that. But if you don't have a set of, whether it's team leaders, junior managers, senior managers, leadership team members that understand how to effectively manage teams, you can bring all of the stuff in the world, but fundamentally you're going to have struggles with retention, also with engagement as a whole. And if you want to scale as a business, one of the biggest challenges that come into it, talk about culture, is culture. How do you remain, sort of focus on what your end goal is as you're getting bigger and bigger, and therefore you're diluting, how people kind of see the business or their team or whatever it may be. So, leadership development, I think, is and should be a core focus, but a lot of places don't do it, not through probably lack of wish, more lack of time and maybe resource in order to be able to do that as well. So I suppose Homemade lucked out from that perspective.
um, there's a question I think a lot of HR professionals, but also business owners, will be thinking about, because when you are in that startup mode, there is a balance, but also I think a dilemma between, do I use freelance support or do I have a dedicated person in the business helping me with something? And so the question around dedicated HR support, do you think that there's a particular size of organization or certain triggers that make you think now is the time for you to get a dedicated HR person in and not just use ad hoc freelance support?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends a little bit on the business. It depends on where it's based. It depends on, I suppose, yeah, when I say the business, i.e., is it, service facing? Is it more of a product base? Is it tech piece? What's the kind of setup in terms of the type of workforce that you're having? The main reason I say that is because that brings in different employee relation dilemmas and aspects with that. I think early doors, probably at that sort of 20, maybe just under 20 anyway, actually. I mean, I'm probably biased here. Like, I think most places should be looking at least having HR guidance, you know, probably from sort of 12 plus employees, to make sure that they really, have everything that they should do. That doesn't necessarily need a full-time employee. But then kind of going on from that, fractional staffing is a really easy way to do it as well, bringing a HR team member in. Maybe that's 1 day a week, twice a week, maybe it's certain hours as well. And then, yeah, you're going to hold me to a number here. I don't know. I'd probably say from about 50 employees, you really should have a full-time HR team member, maybe 40 to 50. Again, depends on the setup of the business. But then equally, I say that in the view of depending on, and I say full-time, maybe it is that fractional staffing for 3 days a week, whatever you actually really need to cover it. Actually, I don't think you even really need full-time at that point. I'd probably say three days, maybe it's a part-time HR team member. But again, that would depend on, let's say you did have a really junior workforce and maybe it was customer facing. You might want to have a more hands-on HR team member, depending on, again, on what your leadership and management team are like in terms of their experience. Often, if you think about it with startups, you have very, very junior managers who might have promoted through, and they might not necessarily have that people management experience. So maybe you need, an experienced HR person in order to sort of coach and guide, when maybe our senior leadership team doesn't necessarily have the time to do that as well. So, yeah, I didn't stick to a single number there. I chucked multiple ones out, but yeah, I think you'll probably know when the time is right, when you're finding that you're taking on too much employee relations work. And I'd probably say as soon as you're asking the questions of, I don't know, and you're going to ChatGPT for answers, probably should start thinking about that fractional staffing initially. And then they would be able to guide you to when to say, actually, you probably want to have a full-time team member at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so dependent.
Yeah, I think probably another slightly unfair question, because it's like you said, it can depend a lot on the type of business, but also I do agree. I think the fractional approach can make a lot of sense in some cases, because if you get a full time or even a part-time person, I think the challenge often is, do you get a support person in? Do you get a manager in? Do you get a senior person in? So, for example, if you get general sort of HR support, it might be that the CEO wants to talk about developing people strategy, and then they need a fractional person in to come support with that. For example, organizations get in touch, might say, we want to benchmark our executive roles. And if you have a dedicated person, they're only going to have certain set of skills and not be able to do all of these different things. But with fractional support, you're able to access different people for different priorities.
Yeah, completely. And I hope I'm okay to shout this out. And we kind of spoke about this before, but I didn't say this at the beginning. So I'm actually moving into a new role, so founders HR, which is, we provide fractional staffing for startups and scale ups. And, I think there's a lot of places that, maybe wait a little bit too long. So it's more of a shout out of, people are interested on that side of things, all sort of full HR generalist kind of work across the board. Which, yeah, an exciting new venture for me. But yeah, I think kind of plays to sort of my conversation about that piece. It's, I think it depends on so many different avenues when it comes to that startup or scale up situation. But my main pleas is, don't leave it too long, just because. And I think this then goes back to my concern about AI, is a lot of places are probably using ChatGPT to answer a lot of their employee relations questions, which fundamentally it'll pull HR law off the internet for you, but it doesn't think about all the nuances unless you know what you're thinking, that you know what to think about. And generally HR professionals would be the ones to be like, well, actually, if you thought about X, Y, and Z, because actually, if you haven't thought about these, ChatGPT is wrong because you've not inputted them in at those places.
Exactly. So thanks, Helen, for all of your insights around startups and the challenges that they face. if somebody wants to connect with you, is LinkedIn the best place to connect?
Yes, LinkedIn is the best place to connect. Happy to connect with others who have any questions, whatever it may be.
And before I let you go, I'm going to have to ask the question I ask all my guests, which is, what is your favorite film and why?
Yep, good question. So I have to say it's a bit of a random one, but always love the end song. But like Life of Brian, Monty Python, I think it's just an absolute winner towards the end anyway. Probably not HR appropriate.
Yeah.
Always a favourite of mine.
Yeah, I was going to ask you your favorite scene, but I think, like you said, probably not HR appropriate. So let's just put it on our list to as a film to watch again.
Definitely.
Great, thanks again, Helen, for all of your insights. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you again on the next episode of The Case of the Mondays.
Thank you.
Enjoy this episode? Join the Academy for free and have access to CPD certified reward training, quarterly reward community sessions, first access to salary insights reports, reward and benefits market data, and hundreds of free practical tools and templates.